All right, test, yeah. Hello. Test. All right.
Hello.
Well, quite a full room we've got. I think that's what happens at 7 p.m. If anybody would like to get themselves a drink from downstairs and bring it back, that's fun too. But regardless, we got a late start, so we're going to go ahead and get going. So I'm Max Dubison from Indigo Ag. We're a sustainable agriculture company. I lead our sustainability policy and engagement team at Indigo, and we work with farmers around the world to help them grow their food more sustainably, and we try to incentivize that through carbon markets and through supply chain emission reductions, and then we also make microbial soil amendments. Ooh. So in our session today, talking about high integrity crediting in the context of agriculture, and the goal here is to hopefully get kind of a good shared understanding of the opportunity that agriculture presents as a climate solution for both mitigation and adaptation, as well as hear from these experts and their diverse perspectives on quality assessment in the voluntary carbon markets and how this is playing out in the context of agriculture. So really appreciate those of you that are here. Maybe before I introduce the panelists, maybe you can introduce yourselves, right? It's a small group. Who are we? Yes. Oh, there's a mic right in front of you.
Yeah. I'm Takashi Hongo.
Yes, my name is Takashi Hongo, and Mitsui Global Static Studies Institute. I follow the policy and the market, and also the ITA Council members. I'm really interested in both compliance and the voluntary market. That's
Great.
my introduction.
Thanks for being here.
Can you hear me?
Yeah, that's fine.
Okay. I'm Jamie Davenport. I'm from Indiana University. I'm a master's student who's actually graduating soon. And so I did some research over the semester about soil carbon sequestration and its potential for meeting nationally determined contributions under the Paris Agreement. And so this is kind of what I'm into.
Right on. All right, I appreciate that. Well, we're going to introduce the panel. I've got a few slides that I'm going to go through, but again, we can tailor this to our audience as much as possible. If you guys have questions, raise your hand, shout them out. But first, to the panel.
Come on over to the...
Yeah, feel free to come up front. Pedro, would you introduce yourself?
Yep.
With microphone. That way it is on the recording.
Wait. So, Pedro Barata, I'm Associate Vice President at Environmental Defense Fund for Carbon Pricing, and also co-chair of the expert panel of the Integrity Council for the Voluntary Carbon Market. That's me.
Thank you. Kristen?
Hi, I'm Kristen Gorgonpour. I'm the VP of Programs at the Climate Action Reserve, or Standard. So what I do is I kind of oversee the implementation of our various programs. Our role is the Offset Project Registry under California and Washington's Cap and Trade program, our voluntary program, and we also have an ex-ante crediting program called Climate Forward. So I oversee the day-to-day work for that team that does all of the review of projects and protocol development, and do a little bit of strategic development as well.
Tommy?
Thanks. I'm Tommy Ricketts, CEO of P0 Carbon. We're a carbon rating agency. We independently assess the extent to which carbon credits deliver on their claims, and we sell that to the market as an additional layer above and beyond standards as a way of assessing quality.
Awesome. Thank you. So, what we've tried to do here is get experts from different aspects of the market to make sure that we're thinking about this and having a good conversation and not just loading it up with one direction. So, first of all, agriculture is a climate solution. It's obviously a huge source of emissions globally, almost 20% of global greenhouse gas emissions related to the agricultural sector. Now that's a broad bucket, so that is grazing lands, orchards, row crops, all sorts of different systems that fall into the agriculture bucket. But it's also a massive opportunity as a climate solution. So not only reducing those greenhouse gas emissions that are coming from fertilizer, coming from fossil fuels, and then coming from the actual land use itself, releasing carbon in the soil, we can reverse that. We can be putting carbon back in the soil through changing those practices. So what we've screenshotted here from the IPCC report, they're estimating nearly 3 gigatons a year of carbon could be sequestered in agricultural soils by 2030, again, if we get the ag systems change that we need. When we're talking about row crop agriculture is mostly what Indigo's been focused on. We're talking about primarily cover crop introduction, so keeping a living root in the soil for more of the year. I like to think of it as, the field is like the factory. Our technology is photosynthesis, and right now if you just harvest your crop and let it sit for 4 months, 5 months before you plant another one, you're just shutting down the factory. You're not producing anything. So cover crops is one of the most impactful that we've found. Going to no-till, reduced till, so reducing that disturbance, that one can take longer to have an impact, but after you start getting 3, 5, 6 years of no-till in a system, the soil really starts to rebound and build soil health. Diversifying the system, so planting different crops, avoiding monocultures. Most farmers that we're finding, at least in the US, are already doing some sort of crop rotation, but they can make it even more diverse. And even if they're already doing cover crops, you can make that more diverse. The really highly regenerative growers might be doing 7, 10, 13 different species at once in their cover crops. And then reducing inputs, applying less fertilizer, using less fossil fuels. These can all have a big impact. And with that, you get a lot of co-benefits. You get water quality improvements, you get air quality improvements, water quantity reductions, and in some cases biodiversity improvements, depending on the systems. And then more income going into these rural communities. So when we come into the carbon market, probably about 4 or 5 years ago, it was clear right from the start to us that we needed to go for the highest quality, highest integrity that we could, and that has really borne out in the marketplace now, right? So I thought the ecosystem service or ecosystem marketplace report that just came out focused entirely on the value that's coming from high quality. So how do we do high quality? There's all sorts of programs out there to assess quality. And so the chart I've got here, just some examples, ICROA looking at the quality of crediting programs, and then ICVCM, CORSIA, in different ways looking at both the programs, but then getting a level deeper, looking at the methodologies and how credits are created, and then the rating services going to projects themselves, digging into the data and actually rating the projects. And so there's this whole ecosystem kind of building up around quality, but hopefully converging. So we wanted to focus in here on the ICVCM and the core carbon principles. So we've got 10 principles. It seems clear to us that these labels are going to fundamentally shift the way the market works. As it scales up and there's more CCP labeled credits, you're going to really see real difference in price, and I think a lot of changes to the way people are generating projects and credits. I think one thing that's interesting is this assessment process that we'll talk a bit more about. It ends up, there's going to be a lot of power in the hands of these assessors and how they apply the assessment framework and the core carbon principles and what decisions get made along the way, and whether any additional requirements are layered on could have massive impacts. And in the case of agriculture, what I'm going to talk through is some unique considerations. I feel like when you're looking at assessing these agricultural projects, there's some specific expertise you want to make sure that the people have. So when we pull from the core carbon principles, and I don't need to go through all of this in every line, we looked at sort of 6 of them that we felt like there was something unique in the agricultural space in terms of the considerations. So additionality, permanence, robust quantification, no double counting, verification, and then the sustainable development benefits. So some examples. In the additionality side, it's much more complicated. The decision process for farmers, they're making management decisions not only every year, but daily. So in their case, implementing a project doesn't mean like building a factory or facility and running it for 10 years and getting credits. It's trying something out, and then hopefully it works, and they do it again the next year. But it can take several years of them doing it before it's not trying to them, it's actually their new system. So assessing that in terms of additionality can get complicated. In terms of permanence, here's where we have to think in the aggregate. We're not looking at the farm as one facility. We think of the farm as like one tree in a whole forest. And so you've got aggregate all together, and now you've got a pool of carbon, and it's coming up and down in individual fields and farms, but as long as that pool across the entire project can be stable and growing over time, you can feel more confident of the durability of the credits. Because even at the field level, that carbon is cycling throughout the year. It's not sort of locking away each molecule in a little vault. On the quantification side, that can also get very complicated. There's a lot of different ways, measurement techniques, models, there's different types of models. And so there, I think it's going to be too hard when assessing quality to look at, are they using the good model? Because there's so many models, it's changing, there's new data come out, different models can get calibrated differently. And so it's more about, is there a robust framework within which that quantification is taking place, where you can assess how they're quantifying uncertainty and how they're reporting, and how can the verifier see what's going into it, and actually verify that they're doing it according to the protocol. In the double counting, I think that's a space where in ag we need to get to a place where we're able to monitor participation of parcels of land and make sure they're not in different programs. So it's not something that's widely available today, but we've been having a lot of conversations with a few different groups trying to build these sorts of systems so that all ag project developers using these land-based projects can participate and make sure that they're not, double enrolling. In terms of verification, I think the key there is just there's some specific expertise needed. You've got to make sure the verifiers understand soil sampling and understand the modeling that's going on. In some cases, you can rely on independent expertise to support that, but it's a little different than other project types where it's more sort of industrial and common and easy for them to use a checklist. So I think with that, we'll go ahead and transition over to our conversation with the panelists. I think you've heard enough directly from me. So I'm going to start here on my left with Pedro. So putting on your ICDCM hat for a moment, can you maybe give a little more color to the mechanics of the core carbon principle labels, and the program assessments and the category assessments, who's doing these assessments, and then how does that assessment then turn into a label?
Thank you, Max. Thank you for the invitation. So I'll try to sketch out as briefly as I can what the assessment procedure will look like. So right now we have the core carbon principles, and we have, on top of the core carbon principles, we have an assessment framework, meaning a number of, let's call it a checklist that needs to be run through. And that checklist includes both elements that are typically checked at the program level, and by program meaning a carbon crediting standard like CAR or ACR, and elements that are really typically at the project type or methodology level even. So to give you an example, we'll be looking into how, to some specific governance principles at the carbon crediting program level. So for instance, do the programs have the right rules related to conflict of interest, or the right rules related to third-party verification to ensure that there's independent third-party verification? And then we will, in parallel, to this program level assessment, which is already ongoing, by the way, and I can report that we have enough carbon crediting programs have applied to cover what is currently 92% of the overall issuance in the market. Bear in mind that's not what's going to make it through the CCP label, so I just want to make sure that people understand that. But the point being, those criteria at program level will then be kind of supplemented in parallel with an analysis that is going to be undertaken at what we call a category or project type level. So to take, the issue here, agriculture, we will be kind of honing in with a set of experts on agriculture, thinking through, looking at the landscape of methodologies that are right now existing in the market, and thinking through what's the practice, and how does that practice at methodology level meet our criteria on additionality, on quantification, on permanence, etc. So there's two parallel processes, one at program level and one at category level. So let's imagine that we're looking at CAR, and that CAR has an agricultural methodology that we will be checking in. In order for a CCP label to be given to a particular CAR issued credit in agriculture, both CAR as a program must meet our program level criteria, and the agricultural credits that CAR issues must meet our category level criteria. Now, all of this process seems convoluted. It is a bit, but the hope is that we're on track. So most carbon crediting programs have submitted and are already being assessed. We're on track to finish that program assessment relatively soon, in a couple of months, well, maybe a little bit more. We will start the category level assessments as soon as the COP starts, as soon as COP finishes. And that's basically where we are. I think we will probably have, if we have agriculture credits meeting CCP labels, we should have them by sometime in the middle of next year. I think that kind of sketches out what the process will be.
And one quick follow-up is, on the category assessments, as you're assessing different categories, will that happen in parallel, different categories at the same time, or are they going to be sort of one category, then the next, and then the next?
So there's actually two separate stages, and we've just finished the first stage. The first stage was what we called fast tracking, checking which categories could be fast tracked. What does that mean? It means that under our system, if you fast track a category, it doesn't go into a deeper assessment. It's recognized as it is CCP compliant, and the ICVCM Secretariat, with some external assistance from some experts, will be putting out recommendations, hopefully really soon. I mean, let's say January, February, March, we'd be hoping for those recommendations. That fast tracking exercise is nearly finished. I can't tell you whether something has been fast tracked because it's not been decided upon really, but basically, yes, the recommendations have gone out to the board. But then if, again, let's say agriculture is not fast tracked, then it goes into what we call the multi-stakeholder working group exercise. And that is going to take longer, but again, I come back to what I said. Our hope is that most of the work will be running in parallel, so we will have, let's say, renewables or RED or ARR or agriculture in parallel groups, as many as we can, let's say, structurally convene. So we won't have everything at the same time, but we hope to have 3 or 4 in each go, put it this way.
Super helpful, thank you. So Kristen, turning to you as someone in a carbon crediting program, curious, like, how's the Climate Action Reserve thinking about the core carbon principles? And maybe you could even broaden it. How are you thinking about these kind of external quality factors that are kind of coming in, including, rating services that are rating your projects? And specifically, like, have these led to any changes in your policies or the way the program operates?
Yeah, so we are one of the programs that have applied to the ICVCM. I think from the reserve's inception, we've always strived for a high level of integrity, really focusing on, rigor, looking at the quantification, additionality, permanence. And so we welcome this, global standard to kind of really define what is high integrity. And we're really supportive of the ICVCM. We think it's important for the market. It's going to strengthen the market because we need everybody to come to the table to really adopt high integrity standards. In terms of like updates to our program, I think as we were kind of applying to the ICVCM, there's a lot of things that we did or that we have done as a program since the very beginning, but maybe we weren't as explicit about those things, maybe like in our program documents. And so we went through a process of, updating our program manual to kind of really just be explicit about how we do things. So, for example, with like local stakeholder engagement, we've made that a little bit clearer, have adopted a new process for getting that stakeholder engagement earlier in the process. We have one area that we updated was requiring a qualitative assessment of SDGs. That was previously, it was voluntary in terms of trying to get CORSIA or being deemed CORSIA eligible. So looking at that, I think, so really just again, being more explicit about things that we already did. I think through the ICVCM application process, there could be things that we'll probably update or kind of fine tune. And again, we welcome those things because we want to kind of meet the standards and kind of have a level playing field across the board. In terms of thinking about how all of this kind of is pieced together with like the different ratings agencies like B0 and ICVCM, I think for us it's a question mark. I think we're not sure how all of these things are going to kind of come together or just be integrated. And so, yeah, we don't really have a good sense of what's going to happen. I think we're curious of how this is going to happen in the market, because I think it's important for us, again, very supportive of, procedures to bring integrity to the market, and, we'll come to the plate to figure out, I think we recognize as a standard there's always room for improvement, not just at the programmatic level, but also like looking at the methodologies. I think, as we are looking at the category criteria under the ICVCM, we're thinking about where areas of our protocols that we actually need to kind of address. And so, we welcome that, but I think in terms of just how all these pieces kind of fit together, I think that's a question that remains to be seen.
That makes sense. I'm interested to see how it plays out as well. Okay, so Tommy, from B0's perspective, private rating service, you create your own approach and, independently rating project quality. I'm curious, how you see what you do fitting in with the core carbon principles. Will it affect your ratings? Do CCP labeled credits get a free pass or maybe reduced scrutiny, or is it just one more thing that, gets considered along the way?
Yeah, I mean, I hope people watch because it's actually a very good conversation for people that are watching. So no, we're project level risk-based assessment, right? It's above and beyond what some of the other entities are seeking to achieve. I think maybe take it back to what would, carbon projects are essentially physical interventions which are trying to either avoid or remove some type of emissions, and that you can actually create, essentially an instrument around which is useful for funding that that intervention, which wouldn't otherwise have taken place, right? That's kind of what they're originally for. And then you need essentially an exam paper you have to pass to evidence that this is taking place. And that should always be being improved iteratively and on an ongoing basis. You need a system of market standards which allow people to have confidence in the exchange architecture, whether it's transaction or information the information-based, where ICVCM is coming in as not an NGO, but also not a governmental body, and coming in and saying, here is really a self-regulatory proposition. I used to be in public affairs, and typically industries like regulating themselves, and I think the ICVCM is an attempt to self-regulate, in my opinion, backed by legitimate policymakers. And then above and beyond that, you have a distribution in quality, which I think is intrinsic to this wonderful and wacky thing called carbon credits, which are very heterogeneous and filled with different processes. And we're trying to turn everything from soil through to direct air capture, from mangrove restoration through to, cook stoves into this comparable unit. And for me, it's okay that there's not one standard that rules them all. People will want to compare and contrast those things at a project level, whether it's about carbon quality or social safeguards or other types of performance metrics. And then, where we come in, which is trying to build that gap, that pipe between finance and conservation, is that's actually the language of large institutional scale capital. What they really want to understand is standardized systems of analysis, ways of going about this, an architecture with this regulatory, self-regulatory, plus the rules associated with it, and then a huge and completely interrogatable system of analytics that they can go in and look at it. Because a market where you've got $1 billion investing it versus 500 billion, they require a very different level of detail that they're going to go into. And I think a lot of what we really stand about is to be, whether it's the rating today or tomorrow, it's to be that, at the avant-garde of that professionalization of the analytical underpinning of the way in which we go and assess and take risk in the market, which is very financial, but it's ultimately a way of saying this is about people getting paid to make climate interventions, and the money has a way of talking, and climate needs to speak that language. So I don't think that they're in any way conflicting. I don't think they're in any way trying to be set up to be independent. The alternative, though, I would say, which is a form of market development, is that you just need one authority which everyone can coalesce around and say that is a powerful enough authority that no one's going to question whether it says good or bad. You have one price, because then everyone can, some are in the money, some are out, but you get one clarity, and you get one contract, which means that whatever's delivered against that would fulfill probably a claims motivation or something like that. And that's the full commodification of the industry. But I think that, unfortunately, certainly the past few years have shown us, and the history of the CDM, it's not an instrument that can be fully commoditized because you don't physically deliver it. So it's impossible to know exactly how much carbon is in these instruments. And so for us, as a starting point, we've got to be inspired by other types of financial markets, but not necessarily be ruled by the dogma of them. And so I think, it's very complementary. I've spent a long time trying to articulate that point. Just for our own sake, I was here 2 years ago at Glasgow, and I was on a Kenyan ticket because we were doing some work with an NGO at the time, and carbon ratings were very much seen as as the devil, in terms of like the entrance to the market. And I'm on a crusade to remind everyone that we're not trying to relitigate the space. We're not trying to replace people. We're literally on a mission to try to provide that next level of professionalization of the way in which the architecture of analysis works, so that people can feel more comfortable in supporting the global south or supporting new technologies and new systems of such as this in different types of the economy. So I think, it's a long answer, but it's important to, probably as much for Pedro and for Cara as it is for these guys to say that we're really, that's our philosophy. And I can't speak for other agencies, but that's our philosophy as B Zero Carbon.
It always amazes me that several people have questioned, right, what is the relationship between the ICVCM and the carbon credit ratings? Because you wouldn't ask that of the SEC and financial ratings agencies. And I'm not comparing myself to the power of the SEC, obviously not. But in a way, yes, in the sense that we are a self-regulator. We try to establish standards of practice, very much the way that SEC has disclosure standards, right? But again, those disclosure standards, and I have to acknowledge that we have actually been inspired by, at ICVCM, for instance, on things like governance of carbon crediting programs, by the work of carbon credit rating agencies telling us, here's what we couldn't find out, type of information that we couldn't find out because it's not publicly available. And then us going back to the carbon crediting programs, so like, is there a specific reason why this is not available? Like, we're being told, so it's our role is to set those standards of disclosure, standards of information. Our role is not to act as a rating agency. And I find sometimes people refer to us as a rating agency. And I find it somewhat awkward because we're not ratings per se. We're trying to regulate a number of things and trying to incentivize, because we do not have a strong compliance mandate. We can only work through nudges, right? And so that's our biggest nudge is the power of the market. Is if the CCP nudge is useful enough, then carbon crediting programs will align with the CCPs and will get a broader basis. So, yeah. Kristen.
Sorry, I'll just add one more thing. I think this is more of a question. I don't have an answer to it, but I do, I do agree with Pedro, right? Like the ICVCM is really kind of setting the kind of components that you need, right, for integrity. But one question that I think about a lot is between the different, rating agencies and the ICVCM, if something has like a CCP label, but then on one of the ratings, it has a low score, what does that mean? From our program's perspective, we're already seeing widely different rating scores on particular methodology. So it's a question for us is like, what does this mean? How does this all fit together?
No, that's super helpful. And I think, Tommy, something you said about the commoditization of carbon, it's also sort of rubbed me the wrong way that there's this assumption in a lot of carbon conversations for years, I don't know, since 2008, I guess, for me, that that's what we're driving towards. Everybody wants it to be a commodity, one thing, one price, and I don't think that that's what's good necessarily for the carbon. I think standardization and more alignment, less Wild West in certain corners of the world. But we've seen it in agricultural commodities. It's not necessarily been good for all agricultural commodities that they've been commoditized. And some of our supply chain work is decommoditizing some of those things and saying, actually, what the farmer does adds value, and they should get paid for it. So maybe transitioning there to you again, Tommy, on just ag projects specifically. How does B0 look at ag? Have you done ag ratings?
Yeah, so we're in the process of actually doing some ex-ante ratings. Most of as far as I know, you might know better than me, the majority is still pre-issuance, but there is a large volume of credits coming to market in the coming years. According to my team, and there's about 65 million tons sort of currently being considered under VM0042, which is the sort of leading methodology for that, and about sort of 80 odd projects some way in the development pipeline. Look, we've got amusingly, our soil scientist is called Pete, and he's specialist and PhD scientist in peatlands, so we call him Peatland Pete. And it's a true story, and we have a whole dedicated soil team. And we want to see that supply come to market because we've invested in that capacity, so it's very important for us to have that. I've just got some notes here which I think you might find interesting. A couple of the challenges associated with regen agriculture. One, financial barriers. So, to what extent is the change in the yield, temporary, permanent? How does that interact with additionality? I think that's something that, still needs to be borne out. Two, the sort of cultural and social barriers to opposing or adopting regen practices, which I think is also, and where does that affect? Does that permanence? Or, how does that actually affect the way in which you assess quality? And then, the age-old question of just sampling sizes. When you've got very large areas of, in my head, I think of it like Alice in Wonderland. The Dust Bowl South, where with all these large areas which need to be regenerated. How can you actually accurately model some of those areas, and how can you use the latest combination of remote sensing and plot databases to go and build sort of effective carbon accounting, whether for our benefit to be third party or for the developer and VVB benefit to be approved. And those are the kind of debates that we have internally, and obviously our job is to try to build that intellectual capacity to respond to the way in which developers and the value chain are proposing that they would go about building those projects. But I think those are all very valid questions right now to exactly how this stuff plays out in the context of other types of nature-based solutions, if you will. And one stat which I thought was quite good, which I'll share with you, is just how powerful the potential for soil carbon is. I know obviously people have seen various TV shows, but in forestry, it's about 10% of the mitigation opportunity, but in wetlands, it's 70+%, and about 50% in the grasslands and agriculture. So it's a seriously large and important area, and it's still it was very frontier, to be honest, when it comes to the way in which we go about MBS. So no, I think the team's very excited to see that shift. And in terms of the ex-ante work we do, the pre-issuance ratings, you have a lot in the IFM, ARR, red camp, and an awful lot coming through in the Regen AC, and I think it's very exciting to see that.
Yeah, absolutely. I think I saw somewhere recently that something like 13% of new VCS projects are under VM42 at the moment. So, yeah. So, and full disclosure, we've recently sent your team a data package, so got an ex-post rating, hopefully, to chew on. So, Pedro, maybe back to you. Putting on your EDF cap a bit, and I think kind of following on what Tommy's talking about, maybe speak to some of the work that you guys are doing, thinking about soil carbon and the science, and answering or raising some of the questions maybe that Tommy's talking about in terms of quality and the methodologies.
So I won't speak much because it's actually a separate EDF team within a separate team within EDF that deals with the science. My understanding of that work is that as an organization, EDF is very very aware of several challenges in terms of especially quantification of soil carbon fluxes and what that means for the impact on crediting and the viability of crediting. But one thing I wanted to say as an organization is that, first of all, this is not specific to agriculture. We've actually, we're coming out with a report on a number of what we call impact pathways, you could call it activities, and how, let's say, how ready are they in terms of the quantification methodologies and the science around them to support going towards a market-based solution. And what we find is that there's a number of nature-based solutions which we definitely, so we start from the premise that we definitely need to invest in those. So we would be very keen to see them reach a stage where they can actually be credited under the carbon market. But having said that, we want to make sure that we don't replicate past mistakes of developing, let's say, products under the carbon market that don't stand up to future scrutiny when it comes to quantification protocols, etc. So we're not disengaged. We're very much engaged in the science. We want to see this succeed, but we still think that there's a lot of groundwork to do on the science of, in particular, monitoring for, in particular, soil carbon. But yeah, I mean, this. Having said that, this is and will continue to be a strong source of mitigation activity that we need to tap into.
Thank you. And Kristen, on your side, Climate Action Reserve has been dealing with agriculture in one way or another for quite a long time, over a number of different protocols. These newer protocols, soil enrichment protocol and the new projects coming with that, has that presented new challenges? How are you guys dealing with, the new scientific issues that are coming, and, any changes to the way you think about it?
Yeah, I think this protocol is just, this protocol being our soil enrichment protocol is very unique in that it's, while it is a standardized protocol, it's very complex, and there's many, I like to call them moving pieces, but components that are, project specific. And so to the extent that we could, we, standardized many aspects of the protocol, but there are pieces that give project developers some leeway. And so as we have projects coming through, we have 2 registered projects, just over 130,000 credits issued. We really do have been focusing on kind of like lessons learned. What can we improve on the protocol side in terms of like the quantification, but also where there are project-specific components, how do we like standardize those processes? Like, what are we looking for when a model is validated and it goes through expert review? What are we asking from that independent reviewer? So we can really get at, like, does this make sense? And really just thinking about our internal processes. I think the protocol, our SET protocol, is it's our and I think we're, learning a lot. And so I think that's just our protocol is kind of a continuous learning process. And we recently just opened up the protocol to our next version, to 2.0, to really, go back to an expert working group to say, hey, these are the areas that we've had challenges with. These are things that we have questions about. Can we standardize these processes and really take it to that expert group to kind of help us fine tune and kind of update our guidance so that we can make sure that we're issuing really high integrity credits.
And we appreciate all the work that you and the team do on that, and we're looking forward to 2.0. Any questions here from our illustrious audience? Yes.
I have a simple question. And the first question is, you introduced IPCCs, 3 gigaton per year absorption, but is that the net basis or gross basis? So my question is a kind of permanent issue with soil carbon. So that's the first question. And the next question is how to measure the carbon dioxide containment underground. So I think the sampling method, maybe this is a question that is so the sampling and the statistical estimation, or so this is a really the difficult thing. When I talk with agriculture professors about the soil, and he's agriculture expert, and they monitor the carbon containment underground, but not so easy. It depends on the climate and the soil condition, etc., etc. So he said that it is very difficult to standardize. So because I was asked to measure and generating a credit, provide advice to the company, but still I wonder whether it is possible or not, particularly the permanence measurement and permanence issues.
Sure.
How do you overcome the two difficult issues?
So I can maybe speak to how we do it in our project, and then if anybody in the panel wants to join in. One thing that's really important is, again, that we're not doing it at just a field level. We're collecting data at the field level, but we're not trying to issue a carbon credit at a field level. So the uncertainty bars would be massive. we'd never get above zero once you accounted for uncertainty. So in the project, aggregating together all the farmers, all the fields, in our second verification, it was about 5,000 fields across a little over 400,000 acres, and I think about 400 different farmers. We're soil sampling, randomly selecting fields as they enroll in the program for soil sampling, and then randomly sampling within those fields. And so as long as we've got our data science team each year sort of running a power analysis of how many samples do we need to take. And so that sample density has changed over time depending on the number of fields and where they are and kind of where the overall project uncertainty has landed. So there's been some years where the sampling campaign was almost wall-to-wall every field. And then for the most part, it's not like that. But we do gather management data at every field. So then what happens is the model gets run at that sample point. So we're not modeling a field, we're modeling that sample point. So you do have a lot of heterogeneity within the field, but then as long as you zoom out to the whole project and those sample points are statistically representative of the land within the project, and we can use the soil maps and the management data to then assess, sort of which fields get paired with which sample points as they go through the model. At the other end, you can quantify the amount of uncertainty that came from that modeling exercise. So we've got the sampling uncertainty, we've got measurement uncertainty of doing the dry combustion on the soil, and then we've got the model prediction error, which is the largest source of uncertainty. And we can quantify that through that model validation process. So you only model things that there's already a body of literature with data that you can use to test the performance of the model. The model we use, Dayscent, could model all sorts of crops and practices that we don't use it for in the project because we don't have enough data to validate the results from that. So that's the first part, is that large-scale aggregation and then making sure that you're on top of the statistical design. And then the other component there, we've got the default emissions, things that are happening outside the model. Those are being quantified sort of wall-to-wall on every single field. And it all ends up as one number. So the credits are issued at the project level. And then using the management data, we can assess, basically we've got a pie, we can divide it back up, allocate it back to the fields, and, pay the farmers based on that. And then your question about permanence.
Yeah, see, thank you very much. I understand it's a monitoring and sampling, but we can estimate currently how big amount are being contained. But if that amount is on a net basis, so the next, for instance, 100 ton is net basis. Next year is 100 ton. The 100 to 100 ton. So the 10 years time, so 1,000 ton. So such kind of the accumulation curve will continue forever.
So the other key here is that in the credit generation, you're looking at the difference between baseline and project. And so you've got a counterfactual baseline of what would have happened in the absence of the project. And it's not just carbon stocks, it's carbon flux over a period of time. So you're actually looking at a change in the baseline. Now you've got a carbon change, and then you're looking at a change in the project, and then you're getting the difference of those differences. And so that's what the credit is created on. So each field could have a different historical trajectory based on geological history, based on management history. If the field was in a negative trajectory, was losing carbon, and we implement cover crops or something, they might be losing carbon at a slower rate, and so they can generate a carbon credit on that. That's an avoided emission, right? If they were positive, if they were already gaining carbon, and they adopt practices that ticks that faster, again, they only get credited on the marginal change.
Change of the stock, right?
Mm-hmm. So if they already were doing cover crops and they come into our project and start change to no-till or reduce fertilizer, that's great. They're not going to get credit for the carbon that was there for the cover crops because that's going to be in their counterfactual baseline.
Very small amount, the gap on the increase of the containment volume, stock, at the stock basis is small.
Yes, and it is a small amount. So if we were just doing a measurement-only project, you'd probably wait 5 years between measurements. So the nice thing about using the models is you can credit every year, but we do have to periodically remeasure every 5 years and check the performance of the model and see if it needs to be, recalibrated, revalidated.
Yeah, so kind of building on that, with the soil sampling that's done, is it done during different periods of the growing season to account for differences in carbon throughout that? So whether the field is like fallow, is getting like prep for plow or for sowing, or if it's during like, the growing season. I'm curious if that's getting implemented into that.
No. So the sampling does happen. So the farmers are only going to let us sample at specific times. It's only going to be before they plant or after they harvest. They're not going to let anybody on the field while it's growing. And then the other sort of limiting factor is the soil being frozen, at least in North America. So we have this little window in the spring when it thaws out, but they haven't planted yet, and then a little window in the fall. So the key for us is doing it in the same window over time. So the project sampling is all happening in the spring for us. So we do all the data collection. We know which fields actually had enough data, and then from that, they go into the randomization.
And then I was also curious with the aggregating the fields, what does that typically look like for the unit? How many fields are typically in that? Is it usually like a city that makes up like the one unit, or how many farmers are in it?
In our project, it's all of them. So we have one single project for all of 30 states and 6.5 million acres. Kristen, anything different you challenge from what I've said in the last couple questions?
No, I think you got it right.
Sure.
So regarding water, so you introduced, you commented the water purification was that is the benefit. But in the case of COSIA, the sustainable criteria, the water is a risk factor. So the depletion of water is not allowed. They are not sustainable. So if the church using the water, so such water need to be replenished. I think this is not a practical one, but actually the sustainable criteria, water is recognized as a risk factor. So I think the agriculture side, if we are talking about the sustainability element, then our safeguard, I think the depletion of water need to be kept.
Yeah, no, that's really interesting, and I wasn't aware of that that was on the SAF rules for CORSIA. That's super interesting. I mean, one of the benefits of these practices, once a farmer's been doing this for 5-10 years, and you start to build the soil health, you improve the water holding capacity, and so that means not only in sort of extra rain conditions and flood conditions, it'll take that water down. We've had farmers tell us that their fields can take 5 inches of rain while all their neighbors look like ponds. And then it holds on to it. And so in drought conditions, it can release it again. So, that's a benefit that the farmers see. It makes them more resilient, but it can, over time, start to reduce the amount they might need to use irrigation. Any other questions? Otherwise, we'll, yeah.
I had another question from I'm pretty sure it was the double counting, and what the exact concern is there, like which programs farmers might be involved in that could be double counted, because my main thought is like agroecology, so it counts for like trees as well as like the fields, but I'm curious if there are other versions of that.
The simplest concern is that they enroll in 2 carbon programs at the same time and don't tell us about it. So our contract says you can't do that, and I think most of them read the contract. I know of one farmer that did it by accident. He meant to do 2 different fields in 2 programs and see what it was like, and he accidentally put one in both, and he came and told us about it, and we took it out. And we've also encountered farmers that were surprised when we were like, no, you can't enroll in 2 programs. So that's unusual, but that's sort of the simplest concern. Long term, I don't think that's going to be a huge problem because it's a fairly obvious thing that they shouldn't do. But I think we'll have a bigger issue with supply chain accounting and carbon markets. We're doing both, and being able to track this, spatio-temporal unit who's making claims on it during that period of time. I don't know if anybody else has thoughts.
Spot on, yeah.
Okay.
And the only thing I would say is that, one, there are already initiatives anyway, like the Climate Action Data Trust and others, that hopefully will address some of the double counting risk. I mean, ideally, I would say we should all be working off the same kind of the same map, put it this way, to put it in very blunt terms, so that we know, if a farm is being referenced under a particular carbon program, it cannot be referenced for that same type of carbon flow for others, because there are different types of double counting, and different types of overlaps. And if it's the same activity in the, twice credited under different programs, that's fairly obvious. It's not so obvious, for example, when, to give you an example, you're doing improved cook stoves, you're laying claim to the reduced deforestation because of the improved cook stoves, and then somebody else in your same region is doing a RED project. And how to factor that in, that becomes a lot more complex. And then spot on, the thing that worries me most is scope 3 versus scope 1 overlap across supply chains. So what if a farmer is doing an offset, but somebody is claiming that reduction as part of their scope 3 or as an inset? Yeah. And one thing that worries me even most is that with so much backlash against offsetting or carbon credits, I even hear companies saying, "Oh, we're moving off offsets because that's terrible. We'll just do insets." And go like, how is that any better? Like, who's doing? Like, are you actually going through this program for your insets? Because I don't think so, and that's troubling, to say the least.
Yeah, if you're interested in what I was talking about in terms of land tracking, there's kind of two efforts that have come up around this. One we helped start called Rescue, the Reconciliation of Ecosystem Service Claims via Unified Entity. That we took it to the Climate Action Data Trust. It's a good one, right? I came up with that one. And they were super interested, but so AIDA has kind of taken it as a project to push forward, and they're working with the Space Snow and Chia to kind of build out that system. And then there's a company in Europe called Varda that's launched their global field ID system, doing a similar thing, kind of coming at it from different angles, and both of them trying to make it work for global agriculture. It's the kind of thing that only works if we get everybody to use it. So I think once those systems get demonstrated, the key will be scaling it up. I think with that, maybe we'll conclude. Thank you very much to my panelists. I appreciate it. Thank you very much to our audience. Thank you very much to our assistants in the back, and have a wonderful evening and a good COP.